What if I told you that without Gi-hun, Squid Game would become something much more terrifying? Today I'm going to go over everything that would happen if Gi-hun never played Squid Game. Starting with one of the craziest. If Gi-hun never joins the games, whoever takes his place creates a butterfly effect that changes everything, and I mean everything. The replacement would be just another desperate debtor, but without Gi-hun's empathy, plot armor, and protective instincts. This person would be driven purely by survival, lacking the moral compass that made Gi-hun special. Remember how Gi-hun immediately formed protective bonds during the very first game? He got saved by Ali during red light, green light, and that moment created a protective dynamic that lasted throughout the entire series.
두 사람 덕에 살았어요.
살아서 다행입니다.
His natural leadership brought together Ali, Se-byuk, and even Il-nam into genuine alliances based on mutual care rather than strategic advantage. He had this incredible ability to see the good in people and bring them together under the most dire circumstances. Without this unifying moral force, players would form smaller, more fragmented groups based purely on physical strength or a perceived utility. The games would become more violent from the very beginning because there's no one advocating for basic human decency or reminding others of their shared humanity. But that's not all. If you thought Sang-woo was ruthless before, wait until you see what he becomes without any moral friction holding him back. Sang-woo would emerge as the most probable winner, but his path to victory becomes far darker and more methodical. Without Gi-hun's moral challenges and friendship to occasionally humanize him, Sang-woo's so-called rational approach to survival goes completely unchecked from the beginning. Remember how his intelligence and analytical skills made him invaluable during the tug-of-war game? His last-minute strategy literally saved the entire team from elimination. But in the original series, his gradual descent from caring friend into cold calculator was slowed down by Gi-hun's emotional appeals and moral objections. Without Gi-hun's presence to remind him of their shared humanity and childhood friendship, Sang-woo would transform into pure pragmatism, much faster and more completely. He'd likely begin manipulating and betraying allies from the very first game, viewing emotional connections as weaknesses to be exploited, rather than bonds to be honored. He would form alliances based purely on strategic value, discarding members the moment they become liabilities. But his victory would come at a cost that makes the original ending look hopeful. And speaking of costs, let's talk about what happens to the most innocent player in the games. But Ali's fate becomes so much worse that it's almost unwatchable, and here's why. Ali Abdul's story transforms from tragic hero to inevitable victim. Without Gi-hun's protective influence, Ali becomes even more vulnerable to exploitation, and his inherent goodness becomes a fatal weakness rather than a redeeming quality. In the original series, Gi-hun's immediate bond with Ali during red light, green light created this protective dynamic that extended throughout their entire time together. When Ali saved Gi-hun from elimination, it created a relationship where Gi-hun became an advocate who valued Ali's humanity over his utility as a physical asset. Without this protective buffer, Ali would be left to navigate the game's psychological warfare completely alone. His cultural barriers would be even more pronounced, making him more susceptible to manipulation by players like Sang-woo.
내가 가지고 다니게 안전하게 해줄게.
Without Gi-hun's inclusive leadership style, Sang-woo would likely exploit Ali's trust and physical strength much earlier and more brutally. Of Gi-hun's presence and the dynamic it created, and the way he gets betrayed would be even more calculating than what we saw. But Ali's fate is just one piece of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. And this is where the old man's experiment takes a truly sinister turn that changes the entire purpose of the games. Il-nam's decision to participate in his own games was fundamentally about testing human nature, specifically through his relationship with Gi-hun. Without this specific test subject, Il-nam's experiment becomes dramatically different and more pessimistic. Il-nam was genuinely fascinated by Gi-hun's ability to maintain empathy and moral conviction, even when facing death. This represented a direct challenge to Il-nam's cynical worldview that humans are fundamentally selfish and evil when pushed to their absolute limits. Remember their final bet about whether someone would help a dying man on the street?
자정까지 저 사람이 그대로 있으면 내가.
That was Il-nam's last test of whether he might be wrong about human nature. Without Gi-hun as his primary test subject, Il-nam would be surrounded entirely by players who confirm his darkest beliefs about humanity. Deprived of any possibility that he might be wrong about human nature, Il-nam would likely design the games to be even more brutal and psychologically devastating. His boredom and desire for entertainment would lead him to create scenarios specifically designed to break down whatever moral barriers remain among the players. Which brings us to the most heartbreaking game in the series. Remember how devastating the marble game was? Well, without Gi-hun's influence, it gets so much worse that it's barely recognizable. The fourth game, known as Gumbu, transforms from the emotional heartbreak to cold, calculated elimination. Without Gi-hun's humanizing presence, this game shifts from a tragedy about broken bonds into a systematic hunting of the vulnerable. The original Marble game was devastating because it pitted genuine friends against each other. Gi-hun and Il-nam, Sang-woo and Ali, Ji-young and Sae-byok. These partnerships were built on real emotional connections and mutual care, which made the betrayals emotionally devastating for both players and viewers. Without Gi-hun's ability to form genuine emotional connections, the partnerships would be based purely on strategic considerations. Players would choose partners based on perceived weaknesses, rather than affection or loyalty, leading to more systematic elimination of the vulnerable. The game would become a chess match where stronger players deliberately target those they could easily defeat or manipulate. Remember how Il-nam's decision to let Gi-hun win was rooted in genuine affection and his larger experiment in human nature.
가져. 자네 거야.
Without this specific relationship, Il-nam would likely play to win, fundamentally changing the dynamics of the game. And Il-nam's role in this game would be completely different, but individual games are just symptoms of a much bigger problem. But here's what really changes everything about the games themselves: the complete absence of any organized resistance. Player resistance becomes virtually impossible without Gi-hun's moral leadership. His natural authority and ability to inspire others were crucial in moments when players considered banding together against the system. Throughout the original series, Gi-hun served as a catalyst for cooperation among players. He consistently reminded others of their shared humanity and the possibility of working together rather than competing against each other.
우리가 이 게임을 완전히 끝낼 수 있는
His moral conviction inspired other players to consider alternatives to pure competition, creating moments where the game's structure was actually challenged. Without this unifying voice, players would remain isolated and focus solely on individual survival. Any attempts at rebellion would be smaller, more fragmented, and ultimately less effective. Without Gi-hun's moral authority, potential rebels would be easily identified and eliminated by the guards, or more likely betrayed by other players seeking to improve their own odds. The absence of organized resistance would actually serve the game's true purpose perfectly: to provide entertainment for the VIPs while confirming their cynical view of human nature. And this plays perfectly into the hands of someone watching from the outside, someone who's trying to expose the entire operation, and this completely changes how the outside world learns about the games, if they learn about them at all. Detective Hwang Jun-ho's investigation becomes significantly more difficult without the chaos and distractions that Gi-hun's actions created. His successful infiltration was partially dependent on the emotional upheavals and group dynamics that Gi-hun fostered among the players. Gi-hun's moral leadership and the alliances he formed created numerous distractions for the guards and administrators. The emotional conflicts, group formations, and moral debates provided cover for Jun-ho's investigation, allowing him to move around more freely and gather crucial intelligence. Jun-ho's ability to understand the game's structure and the player's experiences was enhanced by his discrete observations of Gi-hun's relationships with other players. Without these diversions, the guards would be more focused on security protocols, making Jun-ho's infiltration significantly more dangerous and difficult. He would have fewer opportunities to understand the game's structure and witness the human drama that made his evidence so compelling. Without Gi-hun's story and the specific human connections he made, Jun-ho's evidence would be less compelling and potentially less believable to authorities. The games would appear more like a straightforward criminal operation rather than a complex system of psychological manipulation and social commentary. And without solid evidence, the games continue operating with even greater secrecy. Which brings us to the final confrontation. But it's the final game that shows just how hollow this victory really is, and why it changes everything about the series' meaning. The climactic Squid game becomes pure strategy without emotional stakes. The final players would likely approach the last game with calculated thinking rather than the emotional conflict that made the original ending so devastating. The original final game between Gi-hun and Sang-woo was emotionally devastating because it pitted childhood friends against each other. The weight of their shared history and friendship made every move meaningful beyond just winning or losing money. Sang-woo's ultimate choice of suicide over killing his friend represented his final moment of humanity breaking through his calculated exterior. His final act of self-sacrifice, asking Gi-hun to care for his mother, showed that some part of his original caring nature still existed. Without this relationship, the final confrontation would be about tactical superiority rather than moral choice. The winner would claim their prize without the crushing guilt that prevented Gi-hun from enjoying his winnings for over a year. There would be no final act of redemption, no request to care for someone's mother, no moment of humanity breaking through, just cold and calculated victory. And this empty victory serves the game's true purpose perfectly, because it allows the entire system to continue unchallenged. And this is where the real horror begins, because without Gi-hun, the games become exactly what they were designed to be. The Squid Game organization continues operating without any significant opposition, becoming more efficient and brutal with each iteration. Without Gi-hun's moral awakening and determination to stop the games, the system faces no serious challenges for the first time in decades. Gi-hun's victory and subsequent actions represented the first serious challenge to the system that the organization had faced. His moral transformation from selfish gambler to determined opponent created the only real threat they had encountered. Free from any disruption or moral resistance, the organization would likely invest in making the games more sophisticated and secure. They might develop new psychological tools to prevent any possibility of rebellion or moral awakening among future players. The games would become even more efficient at their true purpose, confirming the wealthy elite's cynical view of human nature while providing entertainment. Without the threat of exposure that Gi-hun represents, the organization might expand its operations globally, creating similar games in other countries for the entertainment of wealthy elites worldwide. The model would be perfected and replicated without any of the moral challenges that Gi-hun's story introduced. And the person running these games would evolve into something even more dangerous. Let's talk about how the frontman himself changes. But the frontman himself becomes something entirely different and much more terrifying. The frontman's strategies and psychological approaches develop differently without Gi-hun's specific challenges to overcome. His most interesting tactical developments came from responding to Gi-hun's unique moral authority and ability to inspire resistance among players. In the original series, dealing with Gi-hun's ability to inspire cooperation and moral resistance required adaptive strategies and sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. The frontman had to constantly evolve his approach to counter Gi-hun's influence on other players, making him more innovative and unpredictable. Without this catalyst forcing continuous innovation, the frontman could operate with more predictable, streamlined protocols. The psychological manipulation tactics would be refined to prevent any player from developing the kind of moral authority that could threaten the game's structure. However, this might also make the organization more rigid and predictable, potentially making it more vulnerable to other forms of investigation or attack. The frontman's infiltration of the games as Player 001 in the second season was specifically designed to understand and counter Gi-hun's methods. Without this specific target, the frontman would lack the deep understanding of player psychology that made him so effective. But there's one change that's more heartbreaking than all the others combined, and it involves the most innocent victim of all. And then there's the most heartbreaking change of all, the complete extinguishing of the series' most powerful symbol of hope. Player 222's baby dies without Gi-hun's evolution into a protector of the innocent. This elimination of the baby as a symbol represents the complete victory of the game's dehumanizing philosophy. In the later seasons, the survival of Junhee's baby represented hope and innocence persisting even in the darkest circumstances. The baby served as a powerful counterpoint to the game's dehumanizing effects, representing the idea that innocence and hope could survive even in the most corrupted systems. Gi-hun's care for the baby showed that redemption was possible, and that protecting the vulnerable could triumph over pure self-preservation instincts. Without Gi-hun's sacrifice to protect this symbol of innocence, the baby becomes just another casualty of the game's brutal logic. This completes the game's mission of demonstrating that human nature is fundamentally selfish, and that cooperation and protection of the vulnerable are impossible under extreme conditions. The baby's death would validate Il-nam's cynical worldview, and ensure that the games continue as a testament to humanity's darkest impulses. The cycle of violence becomes complete, with no symbol of hope remaining to challenge the system's core philosophy. And this sets up the series' most devastating transformation, because it changes what the entire show is actually about. But here's the most terrifying part of all, how this completely changes what Squid Game is trying to say about humanity. The fundamental message of Squid Game shifts from complex meditation on human nature and redemption to a much darker statement about the impossibility of goodness in a corrupt system. Gi-hun's character arc from selfish gambler to moral leader represented the possibility of redemption and growth even in the most desperate circumstances. His transformation was the series' most powerful argument that humans are capable of change and moral courage, even when facing death. Without this transformation, the show loses its moral complexity and becomes a validation of Il-nam's cynical worldview that humans are fundamentally selfish and evil when pushed to their limits. Instead of critiquing systems of inequality and oppression, the series would confirm that such systems are natural and unchangeable because people lack the moral character to resist them. The show would transform from a critique of inequality into a justification for it, suggesting that the poor deserve their fate, because they're inherently lacking in moral character. Without Gi-hun's example of moral resistance, the show would lose its most powerful critique of systemic oppression. making the games appear as an inevitable consequence of human nature rather than a constructed system that could be challenged and changed. This makes Gi-hun's role in the original series even more crucial. He represents not just individual redemption, but the possibility that systems of oppression can be challenged, and that human nature includes capacity for both cruelty and compassion. His absence would strip away this possibility, leaving only the darkness that the games were designed to reveal and celebrate. Click that video on screen to see everyone that could beat Squid Game